The Legend of Rheineck, Part 1. German Folk Tale. Graf Ulrich von Rheineck was a very wild youth. Recklessly and without consideration did he plunge into every excess. Dissipation grew to be the habit of his life, and no sensual indulgence did he deny himself which could be procured by any means whatever. Amply provided for as he was, the revenues of his wide possessions, which comprehended tall Rheineck, and the adjacent country, to the shore of the Rhine, and as far as the mouth of the Aar, were soon discovered to be insufficient for all his absorbing necessities. One by one his broad lands were alienated from him, piece after piece of that noble possession fell from his house, until finally he found himself without a single inch of ground which he could call his own, save the small and unproductive spot on which Rheineck stood. This he had no power to transfer, or perhaps it would have gone with the remainder. The castle had fallen sadly into disrepair, through his protracted absence from home, and his continual neglect of it. Indeed there was scarcely a habitable room within its precincts, and he now had no means to make it the fitting abode of any one, still less of a nobleman of his rank and consequence. All without, as well as all within it, was desolate and dreary to the last degree. The splendid garden, previously the pride of his ancestors, was overrun with weeds, and tangled with parasites and creepers. The stately trees, which once afforded shelter and shade, as well as fruits of the finest quality and rarest kinds, were all dying or withered, or had their growth obstructed by destroying plants. The outer walls were in a ruinous condition, the fortifications were everywhere fallen into decay, and the alcoves and summer houses had dropped down, or were roofless, and exposed to the weather. It was a cheerless prospect to contemplate, but he could not now help himself, even if he had the will to do so. Day after day the same scene of desolation presented itself to his eyes, night after night did the same cheerless chamber present itself to his view. It was his own doing, that he could not deny, and bitterly he rued it. To crown his helplessness and misery, his vassals and domestic servants abandoned him by degrees, one after another, and at last he was left entirely alone in the house of his fathers, a hermit in that most dismal of all solitudes, the desolate scene of one's happiest recollections. One evening about twilight, as he sat at the outer gate, looking sadly on the broad, bright river which flowed calmly beneath, he became aware of the presence of a stranger, who seemed to toil wearily up the steep acclivity on the summit of which the castle is situated. The stranger, an unusual sight within those walls, then soon reached the spot where Ulrich sat, and, greeting the youth in the fashion of the times, prayed him for shelter during the night, and refreshment after his most painful journey. "I am," quoth the stranger, "a poor pilgrim on my way to Cologne, where, by the merits of the three wise kings to whose shrine I am bound, I hope to succeed in the object of my journey." Graf Ulrich von Rheineck at once accorded him the hospitality he required, for though he had but scant cheer for himself, and not of comfort to bestow, he had still some of the feeling of a gentleman left in him. "I am alone here now," said he to the pilgrim, with a deep sigh. "I am myself as poor as Job. Would it were not so. My menials have left me to provide for themselves, as I can no longer provide for them. 'Twas ever the way of the world, and I blame them not for it. The last departed yesterday. He was an old favorite of my father's, and he once thought that he would not leave my service but with his life. We must now look to ourselves, however, at least so he said, but that has nothing to do with the matter, so enter, my friend." They entered. By their joint exertions a simple evening meal was soon made ready, and speedily spread forth on a half-rotten plank, their only table. "I have no better to offer you," observed the young count, "but I offer you what I have with right good will. Eat, if you can, and be merry." They ate in silence, neither speaking during the meal. "Surely," said the pilgrim, when it was over, "surely it may not be that the extensive cellars of this great castle contain not a single cup of wine for the weary wayfarer." The count was at once struck by the idea. It seemed to him as if he had never thought of it before, though in reality he had ransacked every corner of the cellars more than once. "Come, let us go together and try," continued the pilgrim, "it will go hard with us if we find naught to wash down our homely fare." Accompanied by his persuasive guest, the count descended to the vaults, where the wines of Rheineck had been stored for ages. Dark and dreary did they seem to him, a chill fell on his soul as he strode over the moldy floor. "Here," said the pilgrim, with great glee, "Here, here, look ye, my master, look ye, see! I have found a cup of the best." The Count passed into a narrow cellar whither the pilgrim had preceded him. There stood his companion beside a full butt of Burgundy, holding in his hand a massive silver cup, foaming over with the generous beverage, and with the other he pointed exultingly to his prize. The scene seemed like a dream to Ulrich, the place was wholly unknown to him, the circumstances were most extraordinary. He mused a moment, but he knew not what to do in the emergency. "We will enjoy ourselves here," said the pilgrim. "Here, on this very spot, shall we make us merry, here, beside this noble butt of Burgundy. See, 'tis the best vintage, let us be of good cheer." The Count and his boon companion sat down on 2 empty casks, and a third served them for a table. They plied the brimming beakers with right good will, they drank with all their might and main. The Count became communicative, and talked about his private affairs, as men in liquor will. The pilgrim, however, preserved a very discreet silence, only interrupting by an occasional interjection of delight, or an opportune word of encouragement to his garrulous friend. "I'll tell you what," began the pilgrim, when the Count had concluded his tale, "I'll tell you what, listen, I know a way to get you out of your difficulties, to rid you of all your embarrassments." The Count looked at him incredulously for a moment, his eye could not keep itself steady for a longer space of time. There was something in the pilgrim's glance as it met his that greatly dissipated his unbelief, and he inquired of him how these things could be brought about. "But, mayhap," continued the pilgrim, apparently disregarding the manifest change in his companion's impressions regarding him, "mayhap you would be too faint-hearted to follow my advice if I gave it you." The Count sprang on his feet in a trice, and half unsheathed his sword to avenge this taunt on his manhood, but the pilgrim looked so unconcerned, and evinced so little emotion at this burst of anger, that the action and its result were merely momentary. Ulrich resumed his seat, and the pilgrim proceeded. "You tell me that you once heard from your father, who had it from his father, that your great-grandfather, in the time when this castle was beleaguered by the Emperor Conrad, buried a vast treasure in some part of it, but which part his sudden death prevented him from communicating to his successor." The Count nodded acquiescence. "It is even so," he said. "In eastern lands have I learned to discover where concealed treasures are hidden," pursued the pilgrim, and the Count grasped him by the hand. To be continued.